Silence has a way of making people uncomfortable. When someone doesn't speak, doesn't react, doesn't explain themselves, others rush to fill the gap. They assume, they label, and most of the time, they get it wrong. The quiet girl learned this early. While others talked over each other, competing to be heard, she stayed still. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood something most people don't learn until much later. Noise isn't the same as strength. From the outside, her silence looked like fear. Teachers thought she was shy. Classmates thought she was unsure of herself. Even friends sometimes leaned in closer, asking if she was okay, as if quiet automatically meant broken. No one stopped to consider that maybe she was simply observing, weighing her words, choosing not to waste them. In a world that rewards the loudest voice, restraint is often mistaken for surrender. People who rely on volume tend to believe it gives them control. They talk fast, interrupt often, and push their opinions forward like shields. When they meet someone who doesn't push back, it feels like a win. The quiet girl became an easy target for that kind of confidence. Not aggressive confidence, but casual dominance. The kind that shows up in eye rolls, side comments, and jokes made just loud enough for others to hear. They would say things around her, not to her. They would decide things for her, assuming she wouldn't object. When group decisions were made, her opinion was skipped, not out of cruelty, but out of habit. Silence made her invisible, and invisibility made people careless. There's a strange assumption that if someone doesn't defend themselves out loud, they don't have a defense at all. That assumption creates a false sense of safety. People relax. They say more than they should. They step closer than they would if they sensed resistance. The quiet girl noticed this pattern again and again. The louder someone was, the more certain they seemed that she posed no threat. Weakness, after all, is easy to project onto someone who refuses to perform strength in familiar ways. She didn't puff up her chest. She didn't sharpen her voice. She didn't rehearse clever comebacks. To many, that meant she lacked them. What they didn't see was the discipline behind her silence. Holding back words requires control. Choosing not to react takes effort. It's much easier to lash out than to stay still. The quiet girl had learned that reacting too soon gives power away. When you speak in anger, your words belong to the moment, not to you. She watched others fall into that trap constantly. Arguments escalated because someone couldn't stop talking. Fights grew because pride needed an audience. She saw how quickly loud people gave away their intentions, their insecurities, their limits. Her silence wasn't emptiness. It was space. Space to see who people really were when they thought no one was challenging them. Space to listen, to remember, to understand dynamics others missed because they were too busy asserting themselves. While others were busy proving their strength, she was learning theirs. Still, perception matters. And the perception around her solidified over time. Quiet became weak. Calm became passive. Stillness became submission. People spoke to her slowly, as if she might not keep up. They explained obvious things. They assumed she needed help when she didn't ask for it. Each small interaction reinforced the same false narrative. The danger of underestimating someone like her is that you stop being careful. You stop watching your words. You stop preparing for resistance. You assume that if conflict ever comes, it will be one-sided. That assumption is comforting. It makes people bold. It makes them careless. The quiet girl never corrected them. Not because she couldn't, but because correcting them would have required her to step into their game. A game built on volume and reaction. She understood that once you accept someone else's definition of strength, you start playing by their rules. She chose not to play at all. So when people looked at her and saw weakness, they were really seeing their own misunderstanding reflected back at them. They saw silence and filled it with their own fears and assumptions. They saw restraint and mistook it for lack. And every time they did, they stepped 1 inch closer to a line they didn't realize they were crossing. Silence doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand attention. It waits. And waiting, when mistaken for weakness, gives others just enough confidence to make their next move without thinking twice. It didn't happen all at once. There was no sudden shove or raised voice to mark the beginning. The moment she was surrounded came quietly, almost politely, the way pressure often does. One person stepped closer than necessary. Another blocked the space she would normally use to leave. A third leaned in, smiling, as if this was all casual, harmless, nothing worth reacting to. From the outside, it could have looked like a conversation forming. From the inside, it felt like a door closing. She noticed the shift immediately. The room didn't get louder, but it changed. The air tightened. The pauses between words stretched just long enough to feel intentional. She became aware of where everyone was standing, how their bodies angled inward, how their feet planted themselves as if they had already decided she wasn't going anywhere. No one said, "We've got a problem." They didn't have to. Their positioning said it for them. This was how things usually started. Not with aggression, but with assumption. The assumption that she wouldn't push past them. That she wouldn't call attention to what was happening. That she would do what she always did and shrink, apologize, or wait for it to pass. People surrounded her because they believed she would let them. Their voices stayed calm. Too calm. Questions were asked that weren't really questions. Comments were made that carried an edge, but no outright insult. It was the kind of moment designed to provoke a reaction while still offering plausible deniability. If she snapped, she would look unreasonable. If she stayed quiet, they could continue. Either way, they believed they were in control. She felt every eye on her, measuring. They were waiting for something familiar. A nervous laugh. A soft explanation. Maybe even a stammered defense. Anything that would confirm what they already believed about her. The circle held steady, not touching her, not threatening her directly, but close enough to remind her that she was outnumbered. What they didn't realize was that surrounding someone reveals more about the people doing it than the person at the center. In that moment, their confidence showed through their proximity. They stood close because they felt safe doing so. They leaned in because they didn't expect resistance. Each step inward was built on the belief that she had none to give. She became acutely aware of her own body. The steady rhythm of her breathing. The weight of her feet against the floor. The way her hands rested, relaxed at her sides. She didn't move, not because she was frozen, but because she was choosing stillness. Movement would signal urgency. Stillness signaled control. Time stretched. Seconds felt longer when no one filled them with noise. Someone shifted their weight, uncomfortable with how long she was taking to respond. Another cleared their throat, as if to remind her that the spotlight was on her. The pressure increased, not through volume, but through expectation. Being surrounded creates a specific kind of vulnerability. There's no clear direction to move without brushing past someone. No obvious ally to turn to. It's meant to make you feel small, to remind you that the group has the advantage. They were counting on that feeling to do the work for them. But the quiet girl had learned something about moments like this. When people surround you, they expect movement outward or collapse inward. They don't expect stillness. Stillness disrupts the script. It forces them to sit with the situation they created instead of rushing through it. The circle wasn't just physical. It was social. Each person there was backed by the others, reinforced by shared glances and subtle nods. They drew confidence from being together, from the idea that responsibility was diluted among them. If something went wrong, it wouldn't be on any one person. That safety made them bolder. She saw all of this without lifting her head. She felt the intention behind their casual words, the testing of boundaries disguised as concern or humor. This was the moment they believed they had leverage, the moment they believed she had none. What they didn't see was that by surrounding her, they had committed themselves. They had taken a position that required follow-through. Once you close a circle, you can't pretend it was an accident. And without realizing it, they had placed themselves in a position where the next move mattered more than the last. They waited. And in that waiting, the balance they thought they had began to shift, quietly, imperceptibly, like weight settling before a sudden change in direction. Everyone around her was waiting for the same thing. They didn't say it out loud, but it hung in the air between them. They expected an explosion. Not necessarily shouting or violence, but some kind of emotional break that would justify what they were doing. A raised voice. A sharp comment. Tears, maybe. Anything that would confirm their belief that pressure would finally make her crack. People are comfortable when situations follow familiar patterns. They had seen this scene play out before, just with different faces. Someone gets cornered, Someone reacts, and the group responds by labeling that reaction as the problem. If she snapped, they could point to it and say, "See, this is why we stepped in. This is why she needed to be confronted." They were waiting for proof that they were right. The strange thing was how confident they felt about it. Confidence born not from certainty, but from repetition. Loud people had always won in their world. The ones who spoke first and fastest set the tone. The ones who filled silence controlled the narrative. They assumed that when silence was pushed hard enough, it would shatter into noise. Their bodies reflected that expectation. Arms crossed, jaws set, eyes narrowed just enough to look serious. Some leaned back slightly, bracing for impact. Others leaned forward, ready to jump in with their own words the moment she spoke. They weren't listening for understanding. They were listening for ammunition. Someone gave a small, impatient laugh. Another sighed, as if her delay was an inconvenience. These were subtle signals meant to hurry her along, to push her toward the reaction they were waiting for. Silence, in their minds, was temporary. It was a pause before the inevitable outburst. What they didn't consider was that not all silence is pressure building toward release. Sometimes it's pressure already mastered. They assumed restraint had a limit because theirs did. They knew how hard it was for them to stay quiet when they felt challenged. They projected that struggle onto her. In their expectation of an explosion, they prepared themselves emotionally. They rehearsed responses in their heads. Comebacks, explanations, even apologies they could use later if things went too far. Planning like this gave them a sense of control. If they could predict her reaction, they could manage the outcome. This expectation also gave them permission to push harder. They asked sharper questions. They repeated the same point in different ways. They pressed, not because they needed answers, but because they wanted movement. Stillness made them uneasy. Noise would restore balance. The irony was that the more they waited for her to explode, the more exposed they became. Expectation narrows vision. When you're certain about what will happen next, you stop noticing what is actually happening. They missed the way their own tension was rising. They didn't hear the shift in their own voices, the impatience creeping in. Each second that passed without her reacting stretched their confidence thinner. It's difficult to stay aggressive when the other person refuses to mirror your energy. Without opposition, their stance began to feel performative, like actors stuck on a stage with no cue to move forward. Still, they clung to their expectation. Someone like her had to break eventually. Quiet people always do. That belief was comforting. It reinforced the idea that power belonged to those who demanded it. If she exploded, it would validate everything they thought about strength, about dominance, about who gets to control a situation. They mistook composure for denial. They thought she was bottling things up, that silence meant damage accumulating beneath the surface. They didn't understand that calm could be intentional, practiced, even strategic. To them, emotional control was something you lost under pressure, not something you used. Their anticipation created a strange tension, like standing too close to a door you expect to burst open. Flinches became more frequent. Someone shifted their stance, ready to step back if she raised her voice. Another glanced at the others, silently checking if they were prepared for what was coming. And yet, nothing came. The longer the explosion failed to arrive, the more the moment turned on them. Waiting for chaos made their own behavior stand out. Their questions sounded less reasonable. Their closeness felt less justified. Without a reaction to anchor their actions, they were left holding pressure with nowhere to release it. They had expected her to give them a reason to escalate, a reason to dominate the narrative, a reason to walk away feeling victorious or righteous. Instead, they were met with something they hadn't planned for, silence that didn't crack. And in that unbroken quiet, the certainty they brought into the moment began to erode, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that they might have misread her entirely. Her choice to stay silent wasn't accidental. It wasn't hesitation or confusion. It was a decision made faster than any spoken response could have been. In that moment, she weighed every option without moving a muscle. Speaking would invite interruption. Explaining would invite debate. Defending herself would turn the focus onto her behavior instead of theirs. Silence was the only move that didn't hand them control. She knew what words would do. Words create openings. Once spoken, They can be twisted, repeated, quoted out of context. Words give others something to push against. She had watched this happen countless times. How a single sentence could become the reason someone was labeled difficult, emotional, or dramatic. She refused to offer them that leverage. Staying silent forced everyone else to carry the weight of the moment. Without her voice to react to, they had to listen to their own. Their questions hung unanswered. Their comments echoed back at them. Silence acted like a mirror, reflecting their intent without her having to name it. It took restraint. The urge to clarify, to correct misunderstandings, to set the record straight was real. Silence isn't passive. It demands discipline. It requires trusting that not everything needs to be addressed immediately, that not every provocation deserves a reply. She trusted that the moment didn't belong to urgency, but to patience. Her silence wasn't empty. It was full of awareness. She tracked the smallest changes around her. A tightening jaw. A glance exchanged between two people who hadn't expected this. A voice that lost some of its certainty halfway through a sentence. These details told her more than any spoken apology or accusation could. Choosing silence also protected her. Speaking would have pulled her into their emotional rhythm. Their energy was sharp, restless, looking for friction. By staying quiet, she stayed grounded. Her breathing remained steady. Her posture stayed relaxed. She didn't rise to meet their tension, and without that exchange, their tension had nowhere to go. People often assume silence means agreement or defeat. She understood that risk and accepted it. Let them think she was giving in. Let them underestimate her. Misjudgment was part of what gave silence its power. The less they expected from her, the more their own behavior would define the situation. Silence also denied them the satisfaction they were seeking. They wanted engagement, whether it came as anger or fear. They wanted proof that they had gotten to her. Without a reaction, they were left guessing. Guessing creates doubt. Doubt weakens momentum. She remembered every time she had spoken too soon in the past. Moments where she explained herself only to be dismissed. Times when defending herself had been turned into evidence against her. Silence was not withdrawal. It was learning. There is a difference between being unheard and choosing not to speak. She knew her voice. She knew its weight. That knowledge gave her the confidence to withhold it. When you trust your own voice, you don't panic at the thought of not using it right away. Her stillness unsettled them. Someone shifted, uncomfortable with the lack of response. Another filled the space with unnecessary words, talking more than needed, trying to regain control of the situation. Silence had shifted the dynamic without her having to announce anything. By staying quiet, she set the pace. Conversations usually move at the speed of the loudest person. She slowed everything down. Slowness forces reflection. It removes the adrenaline that fuels impulsive behavior. The longer she stayed silent, the more the moment belonged to her. Silence also communicated boundaries without confrontation. She didn't explain what was unacceptable. She didn't accuse or accuse back. Her refusal to engage signaled that this wasn't a conversation she was willing to have on their terms. Boundaries don't always need words. Sometimes they are defined by what you refuse to participate in. She wasn't waiting for permission to speak. She wasn't waiting to be rescued. She was allowing the moment to reveal itself fully. People show who they are most clearly when they think they are in control. Silence let them keep talking just long enough to do that. There was strength in resisting the urge to fill the gap. Strength in trusting that clarity would come without her forcing it. Strength in knowing that silence, when chosen deliberately, can carry more authority than any carefully constructed argument. They thought silence meant surrender. They didn't realize it was strategy. They didn't understand that by saying nothing, she was taking everything in, measuring the situation, deciding when and if her voice would be needed at all, knowing that once spoken, it would land differently because it had been withheld for so long. Silence changed the balance in ways none of them expected. At first, it felt like nothing was happening, but beneath the stillness, the center of gravity was moving. Power often depends on reaction. When someone reacts, they acknowledge the other person's position, their demand for attention, their right to define the moment. By refusing to react, she quietly removed that acknowledgement. The group had come in with a sense of advantage. Numbers gave them confidence. Proximity gave them presence. Noise, or the promise of it, gave them momentum. Silence stripped that momentum away. Without resistance, their forward push lost purpose. You can't overpower someone who isn't pushing back. You can only expose yourself. As the seconds passed, control slipped from their hands and into the space between them. They were used to steering situations through pressure. Now, pressure produced nothing. That absence forced them to confront themselves. Each person became more aware of their own voice, their own posture, their own role in what was happening. Silence made the spotlight turn outward. Someone spoke again, trying to reclaim authority. The words sounded thinner this time, less certain. Without a response to bounce off, statements felt unfinished. Questions felt invasive. The power that once came from speaking now felt fragile, dependent on her choosing to engage. She didn't shift her stance or her expression. That consistency mattered. It communicated steadiness. People associate power with emotional control, even if they don't consciously admit it. The calmer person in a tense situation often becomes the anchor, the point around which everything else moves. Her silence made her that anchor. The group dynamic began to fracture. When there is a clear target reacting predictably, unity is easy. When that target refuses to play along, cracks appear. One person grew uncomfortable and stepped back slightly. Another overcompensated by talking more. A third avoided eye contact altogether. Silence didn't just affect her relationship with them. It affected their relationship with each other. Power thrives on clarity. Who is in charge? Who is wrong? Who needs to answer? Silence blurred those lines. Without her words to frame the moment, no one could confidently claim authority. They weren't sure who should speak next, or why. Uncertainty replaced dominance. Her silence also shifted responsibility. As long as she stayed quiet, everything that happened belonged to them. Every awkward pause, every unnecessary comment, every escalation. There was no shared blame, no back and forth to dilute accountability. Silence placed the weight of the moment squarely on their shoulders. This made them cautious. People behave differently when they feel observed instead of challenged. Silence creates observation. It makes actions stand alone without justification. Their confidence had relied on the assumption that she would respond and legitimize the interaction. Without that, their actions felt exposed. The power shift wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden realization, no clear moment where they understood what had happened. It unfolded gradually, through discomfort, hesitation, and second-guessing. Each person sensed that something was off, even if they couldn't name it. She could feel it too, not as triumph, but as calm. The tension in the air changed texture. It softened, then tightened again in a different way. This time, the tension belonged to them. Silence had moved her from the center of pressure to the edge of it. What made the shift effective was that it wasn't aggressive. There was no threat to respond to, no behavior to condemn. Silence doesn't accuse. It simply waits. And waiting forces others to confront their own intentions. Without her participation, their behavior lost its original purpose. They began to realize that the outcome was no longer theirs to control. They couldn't escalate without looking unreasonable. They couldn't retreat without acknowledging that the moment had failed. Silence trapped them between action and restraint. Power often reveals itself not through force, but through who can afford to wait. She could wait. They couldn't. Every second of quiet made that imbalance clearer. The longer she stayed silent, the more effort it took for them to maintain their stance. The space around her felt different now, less crowded, less threatening, not because they had physically moved, but because their presence no longer carried the same weight. Silence had stripped it down to what it was, a group of people unsure how to proceed without the reaction they had counted on. They had come expecting control through pressure. What they encountered instead was control through restraint. And restraint, unlike force, doesn't announce itself. It simply stands firm while everything else adjusts around it. The fight didn't end with a shout or a dramatic gesture. It ended the way fires do when they're denied oxygen. Slowly, almost awkwardly, without anyone being able to point to the exact second it was over. Silence did what force couldn't. It removed the fuel. At first, no one noticed. They were still standing where they had been, still holding their posture, still waiting for something to happen. But momentum had stalled. The sharp edge of the moment dulled. Without her response, the tension lost direction. Pressure needs resistance to stay alive. Without it, it collapses inward. Someone spoke again, softer this time, as if testing whether the situation still existed. The words didn't land the way they were meant to. They floated, unanchored, then fell flat. No echo, no reply. The power that once lived in being heard faded when there was no one to receive it. One person shifted their feet. Another glanced toward the exit. These were small movements, almost invisible, but they mattered. The circle loosened without anyone formally stepping back. Space returned inch by inch. The fight wasn't resolved. It simply stopped being possible. What ended it wasn't agreement. It wasn't apology. It wasn't victory in the traditional sense. It was the absence of engagement. Without conflict being fed, there was nothing left to sustain it. Silence didn't confront the fight. It outlasted it. The group had no clear next step. Escalation would have required aggression without justification. Retreat would have meant acknowledging that the moment had gone nowhere. Silence held them in that uncertainty. And uncertainty is uncomfortable. People leave uncomfortable situations when they don't know how to regain control. She remained exactly as she had been. Same posture, same expression, no visible shift to mark a turning point. That consistency made it impossible to blame her for the outcome. Nothing she did could be pointed to as provocation. The fight ended without a culprit. The atmosphere changed. What had felt tight now felt exposed. Without confrontation to hide behind, their behavior stood on its own. Standing close no longer felt assertive. It felt unnecessary. The longer they stayed, the more obvious that became. One by one, they disengaged. Not formally, not with announcements. A step back, a turned shoulder, a conversation drifting in another direction. Each movement signaled the same thing. This wasn't working. The moment had passed. Silence didn't embarrass them outright. It gave them room to save face. No one had to admit they were wrong. No one had to lose publicly. The fight ended quietly because silence allowed it to. Loud endings create winners and losers. Quiet endings let people walk away. What made the ending final was that there was nothing to revisit. No last word to argue with. No statement to reinterpret later. Silence left no loose threads. Without language, there was nothing to replay, nothing to twist into a different story afterward. She didn't follow them with her eyes. She didn't watch them leave. Attention would have reopened the exchange. Instead, she let the moment dissolve on its own. The power of silence isn't just in starting a shift. It's in knowing when to let it finish. The fight existed only as long as everyone believed it did. Once that belief cracked, it vanished. Silence exposed how fragile the whole thing had been. Built on assumption, held together by expectation, dependent on her participation to stay alive. People often think ending a fight requires dominance. Someone has to win. Someone has to submit. But this fight ended because neither happened. Silence refused both roles. It didn't overpower. It didn't give in. It simply stood outside the conflict until the conflict no longer knew what to do with itself. Afterward, there was no dramatic aftermath. No rush of adrenaline. Just a return to normal movement, normal sound. The room resumed its rhythm. That normalcy made it clear how unnecessary the confrontation had been in the first place. Those who had surrounded her carried the end with them. They wouldn't talk about it openly, but it would linger. Moments that end without explanation tend to do that. Silence leaves space for reflection, whether people want it or not. She didn't claim the ending. She didn't need to. The absence of words made it undeniable. The fight hadn't ended because someone stopped it. It ended because no one could keep it going. Silence didn't just end the fight. It revealed how little strength the fight had ever contained, how dependent it was on noise, on reaction, on someone playing their assigned role, and how quickly it fell apart once that role was refused.